He didn't belong there. At least that's what they told him. Sir, this section is for designated family only. Step back, or security will escort you. That's all she said. The girl with the clipboard, the headset, and the practice smile. He didn't argue. He didn't ask questions. He just stood quietly, shoulders square, holding a small card in his hand like it was something sacred. The handwriting was shaky but bold. Dad, I want you in the front row. His son wrote that himself. But no one cared. It was early. The sun hadn't fully stretched across the quiet green fields surrounding St. Albans College in Virginia. The breeze was soft, the kind that made leaves dance without sound. Linda Mason pulled her car into the staff parking lot, heart already beating faster than usual. She gripped a folded graduation program in her hand like it might vanish if she let it go. Halfway down the second column, there it was, Dean's List beside her son's name. She had read those two words dozens of times over the past few weeks, but somehow it never got old. This morning, it hit a little harder. The school auditorium buzzed with the electricity of expectation. Families filled every row, clutched balloons, flowers, and cameras. Laughter bounced off the walls. People bumped shoulders, called out names, and snapped photos like they were catching memories before they flew away. Linda followed an usher's gesture to her assigned seat. Fifth row from the front, center left, good view. She liked sitting close enough to see her son's expression when he walked across that stage. But before she could settle in, something caught her eye. Or rather, someone. He didn't come through the main doors. He slipped in from the side, quiet, slow, purposeful. He wore an old Marine jacket, one that had clearly been worn too many times to still be considered formal. It hung a bit loose on his frame. His boots were scuffed, his jeans faded, but his posture was firm. Hands folded behind his back, chin up, eyes on the stage. He didn't look around. He didn't smile. He didn't seem out of place, but at the same time, like he was entirely apart from everything. Like the kind of man who had spent his whole life on the edge of rooms like this. Linda squinted slightly, trying not to be obvious. Something about him pulled at her. Maybe it was the way he stood still while everyone else moved. Or maybe it was the weight in his face, like he had already lived 100 mornings heavier than this one. He stepped slowly toward the front rows, the ones roped off with small silver signs reading Guest of Honor. His movements were careful, respectful. He stopped at an empty seat near the aisle. That's when the girl in the headset appeared. Sir, this section is for designated family only. My son's graduating today, he said softly. I should be on the list. She didn't even look, just raised the clipboard and pointed. You'll need to step back, please. Linda saw the way his fingers curled slightly around the card. But he didn't argue. He didn't even blink. He stepped back one pace. No resistance. No questions. Two security guards hovered a few feet away, arms crossed. The crowd didn't notice, not really. They were too busy adjusting ties and camera angles. But Linda noticed, and so did three men sitting just a few seats to her right. Quiet, clean-cut, broad-shouldered types. They hadn't taken their eyes off the man since he entered. The old Marine walked to the side wall and stood near the glowing red exit sign. Same stance, hand behind his back, still watching the stage. Like this moment was something he'd fought too hard to see, and he wasn't going to miss it now. The ceremony started a few minutes later. Lights dimmed. The speakers crackled to life. Everyone clapped. The dean made a joke about tuition. Laughter echoed across the room. Linda didn't laugh. She kept looking at the man by the wall. The girl with the headset walked by again, whispering to a colleague. He's still there, she said. I don't think he's even invited. I'll have security watch him, the other one replied. Linda's stomach twisted, not from fear, not even from anger. It was something worse. A quiet, creeping shame that didn't belong to her, but sat heavy on her chest all the same. Because whoever that man was, he didn't look like someone who was lost. He looked like someone who had been found in the worst places and walked back without expecting applause. Then the student speaker took the podium. Polished suit, shiny shoes. The program said he was the dean's son. He hit all the right notes. Thank you, family. Thank you, faculty. Thank you, donors. And then he added one more line. And a special thanks, he chuckled, to the presentable families sitting up front, reminding us what real college values look like. There was laughter, clean, rehearsed. A few chuckles from parents. But Linda didn't laugh. Neither did the man at the back. Neither did the three men in row 5. One of them leaned forward slightly. "That was for him," he muttered. The other two nodded, barely noticeable. Linda shifted in her seat. Her fingers tightened around the program. Something wasn't right. Something quiet but undeniable was about to shift, and she could feel it before it even started. The names continued rolling out from the podium, each followed by polite applause and camera clicks. Families leaned forward, adjusting lenses, wiping tears, whispering to each other with pride swelling in their voices. But Linda didn't move. Her attention was glued to the man by the exit door, still standing tall like he belonged there more than anyone else. One of the ushers was walking toward him again, this time accompanied by a second staff member holding a clipboard. They paused a few feet away, whispering, glancing at him like he was a smudge on an otherwise perfect ceremony. The usher nodded slightly to the security guard, who straightened his shoulders and approached the man. Linda leaned forward in her seat, instinctively. She couldn't hear their conversation clearly, but she saw everything. The guard spoke in hushed tones, probably expecting resistance. But the man didn't raise his voice or his hands. He simply turned his head slightly and answered calmly, "I'm not causing trouble. My son asked me to be here. I'm not moving until I see him walk that stage." The guard shifted, trying to assert his role, but there was hesitation in his stance. "Sir, I need you to come with me." Most people still hadn't noticed what was happening at the back of the room. They were too caught up in the pageantry, the music, the speeches, the orchestrated pride. But a few were paying attention. Linda was one. So were the three men in row 5. Their eyes hadn't left the old Marine. They weren't just watching, they were waiting, like they knew this moment would come. Linda turned slightly to the woman seated beside her, who wore a staff badge clipped to her collar. "Do you know who that man is?" she asked quietly. The woman didn't even look up from her program. Probably someone who wandered into the wrong section. These events always attract extras. Extras. The word hit Linda like a slap. As if this man, this quiet figure standing so still in his worn jacket, was just background noise. As if he didn't carry anything but inconvenience. She turned her eyes back to him. That jacket wasn't flashy. It was old, faded, frayed at the edges. But it was real. He didn't wear it for attention. He wore it because it was the best he had. And that little folded card he held, he hadn't put it down once. Not even for a second. It was creased and softened at the corners, like it had been read too many times and still wasn't enough. The second security guard stepped forward now, gently reaching for the man's elbow. It wasn't rough. It was polite, rehearsed even. But the message was the same. You don't belong here. That's when the old man moved. Not his feet, his hand. Slowly, he reached inside his Marine jacket and pulled out that folded card. He didn't shove it forward or wave it like a weapon. He just held it up like proof. "My son sent this," he said softly. "He told me to sit in the front row." Linda leaned in. She could see the writing. Faded blue ink. Just one line, "Dad, I want you in the front row." The usher barely glanced at it. "No guest pass, no seat," she said coldly. "Please, sir." The man didn't argue. He didn't plead. He just let out a breath and nodded once. Then stepped back. That quiet step crushed something inside Linda. She felt her pulse rise. She wanted to stand, to shout, but she didn't have to. From row 5, there was a sound. A chair scraping. Then another. And another. 4. Then 5. Then 6. 6 men rose together. Not in anger. Not with noise. Just unity. The one closest to the aisle, a tall man with a square jaw and a baseball cap pulled low, stepped into the aisle and walked straight toward the back of the room. Toward the Marine. Toward the man they were trying to erase. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled something out. It caught the light. Gold with silver wings. Linda narrowed her eyes and her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't a badge. It was a trident. United States Navy SEAL. The man didn't say anything at first. Just stood beside the Marine. Then another SEAL joined him. Then another. All 6 now stood shoulder to shoulder with the old Marine. Not guarding him. Backing him. The tall one finally spoke. His voice was low, but it didn't need volume. It carried like thunder in a quiet church. That man doesn't leave this room, he said. He led us through hell. He stays right here. A few gasps fluttered across the crowd. A ripple of confusion. The security guards looked unsure now, looking at the men, at the badge, at the trident. Even the usher took a step back, her confidence crumbling. The old Marine didn't move, didn't raise his head, didn't puff his chest, because this wasn't about proving a point. It was about a seat. Just one. Linda looked over at the woman beside her again. But this time, she didn't ask anything. She just said, quiet but firm, "That man's name will mean something before this day is done." And she stood, because something had shifted, and whatever was coming next, she wasn't going to miss it. The room didn't breathe for a long moment. You could hear the buzz of the lights overhead, the soft shuffle of programs being nervously tucked away, and the subtle crackle of someone adjusting a plastic seat. But nobody said a word. Not anymore. Not after 6 men, Navy SEALs no less, stood in silent formation around one old Marine. They weren't asking for anything. They weren't giving speeches. They just stood beside him like they had once stood behind him in places too dark for the rest of the world to imagine. And without anyone saying it out loud, the tone of the entire auditorium had changed. Linda stood frozen, her heart rattling like a loose drawer. Her eyes were still locked on the man. This man she didn't know, whose name she hadn't heard, but who now seemed to carry the weight of every unsaid thing in that room. His body was still but not cold. It was dignified. He didn't shake or shrink. He just stood with that same folded invitation in his hand, the one his son had written in blue ink. And suddenly, the rows of balloons and bouquets, the jokes from the podium, the expensive suits, it all felt smaller, like it had been dressed up for show, while the real thing had just walked in and no one knew what to do with it. The security guard, now clearly uncomfortable, looked at the SEALs and then to his colleague. They both stood there awkwardly, their positions of authority slipping from their shoulders like ill-fitted coats. One of them took a step back, pretending to check his earpiece. The other one lowered his clipboard and said nothing at all. And then a new sound stirred the room. A voice, older, raspier, rose from the left side of the auditorium. No mic, no amplification. Just pure age command. "I know that man." Everyone turned. Even Linda's breath caught. The voice belonged to a man dressed in a weathered gray coat, rows of service medals lining his chest. He stepped forward, slow but steady, like someone who had learned how to make each step count. "His name is Master Sergeant Raymond Cole," the man said, his voice now stronger. "3rd Reconnaissance Battalion, United States Marine Corps. Retired." Raymond didn't respond. He didn't even blink. The man continued, voice thick with memory. "In 2006, during Operation Firewatch in Kandahar, I saw that man run into a burning compound. 5 Marines were trapped inside. He didn't wait for orders. He didn't ask for backup. He just went." Linda felt a chill crawl up her spine. The room had gone from still to reverent. Everyone was listening now, not because they were told to, but because something inside them had leaned forward and refused to sit back. "He was the only one who came out," the man finished quietly, carrying all 5 of them. Not a single person clapped. There was no applause, no approval, just silence, the kind that stretches when truth finally sits in a room. Raymond Cole remained where he was. No puffed-up chest, no shift in posture, just quiet stillness, like he was holding a moment too sacred to respond to. And then movement on the stage. From behind the rows of seated graduates, a young man in cap and gown stepped forward. His walk was rushed, like he didn't care about order anymore. His eyes were scanning the crowd, searching. Linda recognized the look before she even saw his face. She had seen that kind of panic before, when something important was about to be lost. The young man, Lucas Cole, reached the podium. He didn't wait for a cue. He didn't look for permission. He just leaned into the microphone and spoke. "That's my dad." The sound of his voice filled the room like thunder rolling over quiet hills. Every head turned. Even the dean, halfway into a page of prepared remarks, froze mid-sentence. Lucas took a shaky breath, but his voice didn't waver. He didn't want attention. He never has. Every morning before school, since I was little, he told me the same thing. Stand tall. Keep going. Be someone you'd be proud to look in the eye. His words trembled with honesty, not rehearsal. I'm proud today, he said, eyes locked on the man near the exit. Not because of this degree. Not because of this stage. I'm proud because of him. He didn't finish with a bow or a wave. He walked off the stage, down the steps, past the stunned rows of graduates, toward the back of the room, toward his father. Raymond hadn't moved. Lucas stopped in front of him, looked up, then lifted his hand slowly into a firm, practiced salute. The auditorium didn't make a sound. No one moved. Raymond didn't return the salute. Instead, he stepped forward and pulled his son into a hug. Not a dramatic one, not a staged one, just a real one. The kind that doesn't need words because everything important has already been said without them. The SEALs standing behind Raymond straightened a little more, their backs aligned. Then, in unison, they raised their hands and saluted too. Not to the crowd, not to the stage, to the man they once followed and still did. Linda blinked back, something hot in her eyes. She couldn't even tell if it was sadness or awe. It felt like both. She had come that morning hoping to see her son walk across the stage. But what she had seen instead was a man walk through fire without ever raising his voice. She stayed still, letting the moment soak into her bones. Because deep down, she knew this wasn't about a graduation anymore. It was about something that most people spend their whole lives trying to earn. Respect. And Raymond Cole had just earned it by standing still. Lucas didn't let go of his father right away. He just stood there, holding on, like time had stopped around them and no one had the right to restart it. The air in the auditorium had changed. No one dared to speak, and the silence itself felt sacred, like any sound might break something too fragile to fix. Linda stood like the rest, hands trembling slightly as she clasped her program, heart pressed so hard against her chest it felt like it might tear through. The 6 Navy SEALs stood behind them still, unmoving, heads high, arms at their sides. Not one of them returned to their seat. They weren't there as guests anymore. They were there as witnesses, as shields, as reminders of something the world tends to forget. True loyalty isn't loud. It's silent, steadfast, and unshakable. No one had told them to stand. No one had given an order. But when Raymond Cole stepped into that building, carrying nothing but a card and the kind of quiet presence you don't earn in classrooms, they recognized it. They knew exactly who he was. And then slowly, cautiously, the stillness began to break. It didn't start with applause. It started with motion. Lucas took his father's hand, aged, calloused, still strong, and turned. With their fingers laced, he led Raymond forward toward the front of the auditorium. There were no announcements, no dramatic music, no camera following them, just the sound of their boots against the tile. People moved, not because they were told, but because they had to. Linda watched as rows shifted like water parting around stone. Every aisle they passed through became a corridor of reverence. No one dared to block their path now. The same usher who had turned Raymond away earlier, eyes now wide, lips parted but silent, stepped aside like her clipboard was a brick she didn't know how to carry anymore. Raymond didn't look at her. He didn't look at anyone. His eyes were forward, focused, not proud, not bitter, just steady. When they reached the roped-off section, the same one where he had been denied a seat only minutes before, no one asked questions. No one demanded credentials. The silver sign that had once read Guest of Honor now seemed irrelevant, almost laughable in its smallness. Raymond stepped past it. He didn't hesitate. Lucas guided him to an empty chair, second row, center left, and Raymond sat. Not fast, not slowly, just like a man who finally got to sit down after standing too long for something that should have been simple. Lucas took the seat beside him, never letting go of his father's hand until they were both settled. Behind them, the 6 SEALs remained standing. They didn't return to row 5. They didn't need to. Their place was exactly where it had always been, behind the man who had once led them when no one else could. Linda wiped her cheek with the edge of her sleeve. It wasn't just the moment. It was everything. The way the room had shifted. The way the truth had filled it without shouting. She wasn't the only one. Dozens of parents were watching now. The students, too. Phones lowered. Hands unclasped. Something in them had been pulled wide open, and they didn't know how to close it again. The dean returned to the stage, adjusting the microphone with fingers that fumbled slightly. His expression was stiff, polished professionalism cracking under the weight of something real. He cleared his throat once, twice, then spoke. "We are honored today," he said, voice thinner than before, "to welcome guests of great distinction, some of whom we failed to recognize soon enough." There was a pause, then a few claps, then more, and then all at once, the room stood again. Not a cheer, not a standing ovation. It was deeper than that, quieter, heavier, the kind of standing that happens when people remember what dignity looks like. Raymond didn't acknowledge it. He didn't nod or wave. He didn't even smile. He just pulled the small folded card from his jacket one more time, looked at the line his son had written, "Dad, I want you in the front row," and gently tucked it back in his coat, right over his heart. Because that's what he had come for. Not attention, just a seat. The ceremony moved on eventually. Names continued. Degrees were handed out. Flashbulbs resumed their blinking. But the tone had changed, like a string on a guitar, tuned a half-step deeper. Linda sat with her hands folded in her lap, no longer checking her program or counting names. She was watching something else now. She was watching a man who had been pushed aside become the one person no one could ignore. Without raising his voice, without demanding anything, he had changed the temperature of the entire day just by being who he was. And somehow, that felt more powerful than anything she'd ever seen from a stage. After the final name was called and the music swelled in the background, people began to move again, but it wasn't the same kind of movement from earlier. There was no rush for the exits, no clamor to beat the crowd. It was gentler, slower, like the audience wasn't sure they had permission to go back to regular life just yet. Raymond Cole remained seated, hands folded in his lap, his boots planted firmly on the ground. He hadn't said much, but then again, he didn't need to. Every person who looked in his direction now understood why he had come. Not for recognition, not to prove anything. He came for his son, and he stayed because his son had asked him to. Linda didn't move either. She stayed in her chair, her body still facing forward, but her eyes drawn back, again and again, to Raymond. She didn't want to leave. Not yet. She felt like something had just cracked open, something you don't walk away from casually. This wasn't just a story you tell on the ride home. This was a memory that seared into you. And that's when she saw it. One by one, students began to pass by Raymond's seat. Not with fanfare, not with announcements, just quietly, genuinely. The first was a young woman with tear-streaked makeup. She paused in front of him, swallowed, then lifted her hand in a trembling salute. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for carrying them." Raymond didn't respond with words. He simply gave a slow, respectful nod. His eyes didn't shine, but they softened. Just a little. Then came another student. Then two more. Some stopped to shake his hand. Some didn't speak at all, just laid a hand gently on his shoulder and kept walking. It was like they didn't need to say anything. Like they already understood what mattered most had been said without a microphone. Linda's breath caught as she watched. It wasn't planned. It wasn't part of the schedule. But somehow, it felt like the real ceremony had just begun. From the far side, one of the SEALs, the youngest looking of the six, stepped forward now. His movements were measured, his face unreadable. In his hand, he held something small and round, barely noticeable from afar. He approached Raymond without fanfare and extended the object. Raymond looked down. It was a coin. Not just any coin. A challenge coin. Linda had only seen one once before, at a funeral years ago. They weren't given lightly, and they weren't souvenirs. Raymond took it into his hand and slowly turned it over. One side held the emblem of their SEAL team, etched with precision, gleaming even under the auditorium's dim lights. The other side, 5 engraved words. "The quiet ones lead the loudest wars." Raymond didn't speak. He didn't show the coin to anyone. He simply closed his hand around it and rested it on his knee. But Linda noticed something else. His shoulders, just for a second, eased. Not collapsed. Not defeated. Eased. Like something heavy had been shared. Not taken away, no. Just carried together now. And that mattered. That meant something. The SEAL nodded once and returned to his position. and Raymond sat in silence, challenge coin in one hand, card in the other, surrounded by strangers who had become something else entirely. Lucas turned toward his father again, leaning close to whisper something in his ear. Raymond nodded, almost imperceptibly, the kind of nod only his son could recognize. Outside the auditorium doors, the crowd began to spill into the lobby, buzzing softly, quieter than expected. Some parents still snapped pictures, some students adjusted their caps, but most carried something with them now, an understanding, a shift. Linda finally stood. She didn't want to, but she did. Her knees felt stiff and her legs shaky, but she turned toward the aisle and started to walk slowly toward the exit. But just as she reached the end of her row, she stopped. She turned back for one last look. There he was, Raymond Cole, still seated, still steady, the room finally making space for him like it always should have. And behind him, 6 Navy SEALs standing tall. Beside him, his son, who had given up his moment on stage to make sure the right man had his seat. And in that last glance, Linda didn't see a Marine. She saw a father. She saw a son. She saw what it looked like when the world gets it wrong, and then, for once, has the courage to correct it. She didn't say anything out loud, but her heart did. He came for a seat, but by the time he left, the whole room stood for him. The lobby buzzed, but it wasn't the same noisy hum that had filled it earlier in the morning. Now it was subdued, almost hushed. People moved with a kind of caution, like they weren't quite sure what to say after what they had just witnessed. Some held their phones, but few were using them. Some whispered to each other. Others just stood still, watching the door like they were waiting for someone to walk through and make sense of what had just unfolded. Linda walked out with the crowd, but stayed close to the edge of the room. She didn't want to leave yet. She wasn't sure she could. Her mind kept circling back to Raymond Cole, to the look in his eyes, to the card in his hand, to the way the air in that auditorium had shifted around him like the world was remembering something it should have never forgotten. She leaned against the wall near the side hallway, watching from a distance as more students passed by him. Even as the auditorium emptied, Raymond stayed seated. Lucas stayed by his side, not talking, not rushing, just being there. The SEALs hadn't moved either. Their bodies at ease, but alert, like standing next to him was something they weren't willing to step away from just yet. Then something unexpected happened. One of the janitors entered the room, a man maybe in his 50s, pushing a cart with folded chairs. He didn't seem to recognize anyone at first. He was just doing his job, head down, watching his path. But as he passed the front row, his steps slowed. His eyes lifted. They landed on Raymond. He stopped moving. For a few seconds, he just stood there, staring at the old Marine. Then he nodded, slow, respectful, and touched his forehead in a quiet, informal salute before walking away again without saying a word. Linda felt something catch in her throat. It wasn't the ceremony or the crowd or even the applause that mattered now. It was this, the ripple of recognition from people who hadn't been given any script. People who just knew. Across the room, a mother with 2 small children walked toward the exit, holding hands with a boy and girl in matching Sunday clothes. The boy paused and pointed at Raymond. "Is he a soldier?" he asked softly. His mom bent down, whispered something into his ear, and the boy's eyes widened. Then he let go of her hand and ran forward, stopping just a few feet from Raymond's seat. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, small hands at his side, looking up at the man like he was made of something stronger than anyone else in the room. Raymond looked down at him, and for the first time all morning, his face broke into the faintest smile. Barely there, but real. He gave the boy a small nod. And just like that, the boy turned around and ran back to his mother, who knelt down and wrapped him in a tight hug. Lucas looked over at his father. "You good?" he asked quietly. Raymond nodded once. "Yeah." The word wasn't loud, but it held the kind of weight that only truth carries. Linda finally stepped forward. Her feet moved before she could think. She didn't know exactly what she would say, but she knew she had to say something. As she approached, Lucas saw her first. He smiled faintly, then looked to his dad and gently tapped his arm. Raymond turned. Their eyes met. Up close, he looked even older than he had from a distance. His skin was weathered, his eyes a little sunken, and his Marine jacket had clearly seen better days. But none of that mattered. What mattered was the calm in his posture, the strength in the way he held still, the way he had never tried to prove himself. Linda extended her hand. "My name's Linda," she said softly. "I don't know you, but I needed to tell you that was the most honorable thing I've ever seen." Raymond looked at her hand for a second, then took it in his. His grip was firm, but gentle. "Thank you," he said. "Thank you," Linda replied, "for showing everyone what respect looks like, for reminding us." Raymond didn't say anything more. He didn't need to. She looked at Lucas. "You gave up your moment for your father." Lucas smiled. "No, ma'am. I gave it back to who it belonged to." Linda's throat tightened again, but she nodded. "You both changed something today. Whether anyone writes about it or not, you did." From behind, another student approached, then another, and then a teacher. Wordlessly, a line was forming. Not official, not organized, just people who had something to say, something to show. Gratitude, respect, maybe even apology. Raymond didn't move. He didn't speak much, but he shook every hand, met every eye, quietly, humbly. He wasn't just a Marine today. He was a symbol of how often the world gets it wrong, and how rarely someone stays still long enough for it to make it right. Linda stepped away after a while, giving space to the others. She walked toward the exit and paused just before pushing the door open. She turned around one last time. There he was, Raymond Cole, sitting where he should have been all along. Not in the spotlight, but in the seat that mattered most. Outside, the air had cooled. The sun had slipped behind the tall oak trees that lined the edge of the St. Albans campus, and a quiet breeze rolled through the courtyard, rustling the banners strung across the brick walls. Families lingered in groups, taking photos, laughing again, but it wasn't the same kind of laughter from earlier. It was softer now, tempered, like something inside them had been humbled. Linda stood under one of the arches near the main entrance, arms crossed loosely, still watching. She wasn't ready to leave. Not yet. She'd told herself she came to celebrate her son's accomplishment, but now it felt like she had been meant to witness something entirely different. Something bigger, something quieter, something true. Raymond and Lucas stepped out a few minutes later, walking side by side. Raymond still held the invitation in one hand, his fingers curled gently around the crease. The challenge coin rested inside his jacket, tucked close to his chest. He hadn't said much since the ceremony ended. He didn't have to. The SEALs had exited quietly behind them. Not in formation, not with salutes, just together. Brothers who no longer needed uniforms to show the world what they stood for. They hung back now, giving Raymond space, but still close enough that you knew they weren't going far. A few steps into the courtyard, Lucas stopped. "Wait," he said, reaching into his gown pocket. "I almost forgot." He pulled out a small, folded photograph, creased at the edges, colors slightly faded. He handed it to his father. Raymond opened it slowly. It was a picture of Lucas, maybe 6 or 7 years old, standing on top of a picnic table with a plastic sword and a cardboard helmet. Behind him, Raymond stood with arms crossed and a crooked smile on his face, pretending to be the defeated dragon. Lucas chuckled. "You told me that day to never stop standing tall, even if your helmet's made of cardboard." Raymond looked at the photo. "You actually remembered that?" Lucas nodded. "I remembered everything." The words settled in the air between them, warm and unshakable. Raymond didn't speak. He just folded the photo again and slid it into his jacket next to the card. They walked together toward the front lawn, where families were still taking pictures under the school's name arch. Some people looked at them now, some pointed, some whispered, but no one stopped them. No one blocked their way. Then, just before they reached the sidewalk, an older man in a blue blazer stepped in their path. He held a camera around his neck and a staff badge on a lanyard. His face was apologetic, nervous. "Sir," he said, addressing Raymond directly, "do you mind if I get a picture of you and your son? For the college archives." That moment, inside, it meant something. Raymond hesitated. For a second, Lucas thought he'd say no. But then Raymond looked at his son and nodded. "One picture," he said. "For him." The man raised the camera and snapped a photo as the two stood shoulder to shoulder. Raymond still in his Marine jacket, Lucas still in his gown, the quiet space between them filled with everything unspoken but deeply understood. After the click, the photographer nodded gratefully and stepped away. Lucas smiled. "You good?" Raymond exhaled. "Yeah," he said. "I am now." They continued walking. At the edge of the parking lot, the 6 SEALs were waiting, not in a group, not with attention, but casually like friends waiting to see someone off. One of them, the tall one who had first spoken out, walked forward. He held out a small envelope. Raymond raised an eyebrow. "What's this?" "Letter of commendation," the SEAL said. "Not official. Not from the government. From us." Raymond opened the envelope and read the single line typed on a plain white sheet. "You never stopped walking toward the fire. Neither did we." He folded it slowly and looked up at the man. "You didn't have to." "We did," the SEAL replied, "because we remember what the world tries to forget." Raymond shook his hand. "Thank you. For seeing me. For standing." The SEAL nodded. "You didn't ask us to. That's what made it real." Lucas and Raymond got into their truck, a dusty old Ford with peeling paint, but an engine that still rumbled strong. Lucas threw his gown into the back seat and slid behind the wheel. Raymond climbed in next to him. As they pulled away, Linda finally turned from her place by the arch. She didn't need to follow them. She'd seen what she was meant to see. But she whispered, more to herself than anyone, "The loudest wars really are led by the quietest ones." And for the first time that day, she allowed herself to smile, not for the program she held or the name printed inside, but for the simple, overlooked power of a man who didn't ask for a seat. He just stood for what was right. The drive home was quiet. Lucas kept both hands on the steering wheel, the road stretching in front of them, framed by trees swaying in the late afternoon breeze. Raymond sat beside him, one arm resting on the door, the other still holding the folded invitation his son had written. They hadn't spoken since leaving the campus parking lot, but not because there was nothing to say. It was because some moments don't need words. They just need time to settle in your bones. Finally, about 20 minutes in, Lucas glanced over. "You didn't have to come, you know," he said quietly, the corners of his mouth turning up. Raymond raised an eyebrow. "You think I was going to miss seeing you walk that stage? You almost didn't get to." Raymond chuckled, "Just once." "Yeah, but I did." Lucas looked at him, then back at the road. "You know, there were a lot of people in that room who needed to see you more than I did." Raymond stayed silent for a beat before answering. "Maybe, but I didn't go for them. I went for you. And that was it. That was the truth that had anchored everything." Later that night, after dinner was finished and dishes were stacked by the sink, Lucas pulled out a small frame. Inside it was the handwritten card, the one he had given his dad, now straightened and set behind glass. He placed it on the mantel beside a faded photo of his mother and a folded flag in a triangle case. Raymond stood behind him, watching quietly. "Front row," Lucas said, tapping the glass. "Where you belonged." Raymond looked at the frame for a moment. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the challenge coin the SEAL had given him. He set it on the shelf beside the frame, gently, like it deserved its own kind of reverence. Lucas didn't say anything. Neither did Raymond. But both of them stood there a little longer than they needed to, shoulders just barely touching. Outside, the world went on. Cars passed. Phones buzzed. News channels aired stories no one would remember a day later. But in that living room, something sacred had settled. Not loud, not dramatic, just real. The next morning, Linda Monroe sat at her kitchen table, sipping lukewarm coffee as she read over a few graduation recap emails from the school. One line in particular caught her eye. It was small, almost buried at the bottom of the newsletter. "We would also like to extend our deepest gratitude to Master Sergeant Raymond Cole, USMC, Ret, for his presence at this year's ceremony and his service to our country." Linda smiled faintly. No spotlight, no headline, just enough. She closed the email, stood from her chair, and walked to the window, looking out at the morning sun rising over her quiet street. She didn't know if she'd ever see Raymond again, but she knew she'd never forget him, because he hadn't come looking for a seat of honor. He came with one purpose, to be there for his son. And by doing that, by standing still, by staying steady, by holding his ground with nothing but quiet dignity, he reminded an entire room what honor actually looks like. That's the kind of man people forget until they can't anymore. So here's the lesson. Sometimes the loudest voice in the room isn't the one speaking. Sometimes it's the one that never asks for applause, never demands attention, never needs to be seen, and yet somehow changes everything. Raymond Cole didn't walk into that auditorium looking to teach anyone a lesson, but he did. He taught us that respect isn't something you give to titles or clothing or seating charts. It's something you give to character, to sacrifice, to love. He taught us that the front row doesn't make someone worthy, but sometimes the worthy have to fight just to be allowed to sit there. And above all else, he showed us that being asked to stand down doesn't mean you're not worthy of standing tall. Because in a world obsessed with appearance, sometimes the most powerful thing you can be is quiet and still and true, just like him. Subscribe to Curb Chaos, where real people remind us of the values we're in danger of forgetting, one quiet act of honor at a time.